The morning started like any other coffee steaming on the porch rail, fog lifting off the water, my dog asleep at my feet, and if you'd seen the place you'd have thought peace lived there, like it owned the place. Cedar Hollow sits tucked back from the county road. 40 acres I hammered together myself over 10 years, a hand-built dock that leans a little when you sit on the end, a small cabin with nails I'd driven and paint I'd chosen, and a sign I carved with my own 2 hands that says private. That sign mattered more than I realized until a woman in a navy blazer decided it didn't. Her name was Veronica Hale, head of the Cedar Hollow Community Association, and she walked up my driveway the day my son turned 8 like she was carrying a warrant in her handbag. She wasn't smiling. She had that kind of polite menace people pick up from years of meetings and misplaced authority. "This is a community space," she told my guests at Logan's birthday, like she was correcting a child. "You can't have a private party on association land." I remember looking at her and thinking, that's my dock, that's my gazebo, that's my son's cake, and for a second the air felt thin, like somebody had tilted the world. I didn't raise my voice. I don't like shouting unless it's necessary. Instead, I walked over, handed her the deed, the paper dusty from being in my toolbox, and said, easy and plain, "It's on the deed, Veronica. It's mine." She folded the deed like she could fold the truth, told the sheriff she'd call, and left with the kind of slow, staged outrage that belongs on cable. The sheriff came, looked at the paperwork, looked at the coordinates on my map, and said something I'd been waiting years to hear. "Sir, these lines are yours." He wished my son a happy birthday and drove off. Veronica smiled all the way down the driveway. That should have been the end. Instead, it was the beginning. Over the next few weeks, the small annoyances turned deliberate. A branded packet arrived in my mailbox, Cedar Hollow Amenities glossy brochures that showed my shoreline rebranded with pictures of people doing yoga by the water. Someone had planted a heavy, professional sign at the edge of my property that read Wilderness Trail, an official-looking thing that didn't belong to me. There were printed flyers on car windshields at the county meetings, and then a Facebook post from the association that used my lake as the backdrop for a fall community wellness event. I'd always known committees had power, but power that courted the public to invade your backyard felt like new territory. So I started documenting. Drone runs over the boundary lines, timestamps on my camera, GPS tracks, copies of receipts from my cabin renovations. I spoke with county officials. They smiled politely and told me how messy easements can be, but the GPS coordinates kept lining up the same way the land was mine. The more I recorded, the more the association pushed back. Veronica started showing up at neighbor barbecues with a clipboard, asking people, quietly, if they'd ever noticed the community access along my shore. She turned whispers into a narrative. "He's hoarding natural resources," she'd say softly, and people started to look at my place like it was a relic to be reclaimed. Then they built the bench. Not a simple bench, but a small platform, cedar and professionally milled placement right at the edge of my shoreline with a little plaque advertising Saturdays, guided walks scanned for payment. A QR code. I watched a yoga class there one Saturday morning through my binoculars, 6 folks on mats, an instructor tapping on a tablet, someone scanning the code, and getting a push to pay the association. It was the kind of thing that rewrites reality from private property to monetized amenity, and they were doing it in plain daylight. I confronted Veronica at the county office. She looked practiced, like she'd rehearsed this exact conversation a dozen times. "We're offering the community what it wants," she said. "You can't just close people off." I pointed to the survey, the tax records, the drone footage on my phone. I showed the GPS lines like a map in a courtroom. She smiled, polite and slow, and said, "This isn't personal, Mr. Mercer, it's about community." It was the moment I realized community had become a brand word, one people could hide behind when they wanted to take something. Then the accident happened. They advertised a family day on my shore kettles, a little band, those yoga mats again. There were kids laughing, parents with paper cups, and the bench with its shiny plaque and QR code. Logan was there because he loved the lake and the smell of the wood smoke. He loved his friends, and he loved the chaos of a party where there was cake. Behind the music and the chatter, a small kid, maybe 3, ran too fast on the wet boardwalk and tumbled into the lake. There are moments that reframe everything. The sound of a splash, the sudden silence that follows, the way people move like cut wire. My hands were already in motion before my brain was done being surprised. I dove, cold grabbing at me like a fist, grabbed the child, dragged him to the dock. He was coughing and blue, and his mother was repeating his name like, "That's going to bring oxygen back." Someone called 911. I held that little body until the EMTs took over. When the deputies arrived, they asked a lot of questions. Why was there a crowd on private property? They wanted to know. How had an organized event been set up right on the edge of someone's land? The optics changed overnight. What had been a property dispute turned into a public safety investigation. Suddenly, the association's glossy packets looked irresponsible in a way that mattered. People don't like the idea of a child in danger. Moral clarity is a harsh light. The evidence I collected became a roadmap. The trail cam caught Veronica and a team of volunteers directing people onto the boardwalk, placing cones, arranging chairs. Online payment logs showed small transfers to the association's account for event fees. Maps that the association had circulated were different from the county records. Their community map had an extra stretch of shoreline shaded in as public access. There were emails. There were receipts. Each one was a stitch in a pattern. They hadn't just assumed the land was theirs. They'd actively tried to make it so. We went to court. I don't like courtrooms. They smell like old coffee and paper, but I like fairness more. The judge looked tired in a good way, like someone who'd seen a lot of attempts to bend rules. In the hearing, we laid everything out. Drone footage, tax records, the trail cam video, witness testimony from the mother who nearly lost her child, records of payments. Veronica sat with that smile people use to hide stress. She answered questions like someone reading from a script. When the judge read the decision, it felt like someone had opened a door in a long, sealed room. The ruling was clear: trespass, unauthorized monetization, and negligence around public safety. The association was ordered to remove the platform, to cease events on my shoreline, and there was a judgment to cover damages and legal fees. Veronica resigned from the board 2 weeks later. There were other changes. Committees reformed, bylaws were rewritten, and people who'd looked at my house with sour curiosity started bringing casseroles and genuine apologies. You'd think it ends there in neat justice delivered, peace restored, and that's the story people like to hear. But life doesn't fold up like that. The victory was real, but it didn't fix everything. A few neighbors still looked at me like I'd been difficult. A commentator on the local news called me territorial, in a way that made my wife's jaw tighten. The association's new board rebranded as inclusivity-minded, and there were op-eds about community access and wealth and fairness that made the comments section a war zone. I found myself being dragged into conversations I never wanted about privilege, about land use, about who gets to enjoy nature. And I found, in the quiet after all the papers were filed, that what I wanted most wasn't a court ruling or vindication. It was easy mornings back on the dock, the slow smell of coffee and cedar, my son leaning his head on my shoulder while we watched the sun come up. It was Logan's laugh when he ran across the lawn and fell into the river of light the trees make. I put my carved sign back where it had always been, and I fixed the dock plank that had been loose for years. I started inviting neighbors over again cautiously, with clear notes about boundaries, because I wanted the place to be open on my terms, not as an amenity controlled by a committee. If there's a lesson I'd pass on, and I'm not preaching, only telling, it's this: ownership is more than paperwork. It's diligence, and it's patience, and sometimes it means being willing to stand up when someone with a letterhead tries to convince a neighborhood that what's yours is somehow theirs. It's also remembering that people are messy. Sometimes their motives are fear dressed like community service, and sometimes they really believe they're doing the right thing. The hard part isn't proving you own the land, it's proving that you're going to hold onto your humanity while you do it. So what now? The platform's gone. The plaques are gone. Veronica's name lives in a few minutes of video and a page in a county record, and I don't spend much time thinking about her. But I do think about the kid who fell, about the thin line between a well-intended event and recklessness, and about how a smile and a clipboard can be armor for someone determined to rebrand other people's lives. I think about how communities are supposed to be messy negotiations, and how sometimes those negotiations need someone to point to a deed and say, "No, not this time." If you've got a property dispute, if you live next to a neighborhood board that feels more like a club than a council, or if you've ever seen someone weaponize the word community, tell me in the comments. Was I right to stand my ground? Or did I let pride turn a small thing into a war? Where do we draw the line between public good and private right? And who gets to decide? Drop your take below. Share this with someone who loves local drama. And if you've got a story that makes you see your own lawn with new eyes, I want to read it.